Do Saturday morning cartoons come on anymore? How do you know? Some of you just have, like, you watch them, don't you? And there's like 17,000 cable channels on, and once we get cable on again, I recognize that this week. I noticed there's Cartoon Network on there. And so I thought, Cartoon Network, a whole network just dedicated to cartoons, right? And there's, I promise this has a point, although it might take us a while to get to it. But anyway, so I looked on there and I thought cartoons just aren't the same. The days of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, these are the greatest cartoons of all time. Some of you guys, you'll have to go home. Don't do it during the sermon. You'll have to Google Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. But I got this cup because someone said, you know, I always watched Roadrunner, and I always thought that Wile E. Coyote was the genius of the cartoon world. Never worked out so good for him, but I always figured he was a genius. And then I said, well, why did you give me the cup? I said, well, I'm not sure, but my next favorite one, because I am a lover, not a fighter, the skunk. Pepe Le Pew, right? You know, you remember the cat who Pepe Le Pew was the skunk, but he mistaked the cat. You'll have to Google this one too. And he mistaked the cat for a female skunk, and every time he would go near, you know the drill. Come on, some of you tried this. That's how you got married. Mon ami, right? And every time you see the cat, she would show up, and he would do this over and over again. Well, I told you all that to say this is kind of where we picked Jacob up today. Jacob has been captivated by a woman. And on this journey, so he leaves this encounter he has with God at this certain place, the holy place. He leaves this place and he continues on the way to see his uncle up the road. And he runs across these fellows and he says, in net effect, hey guys, do you know Laban? And they answer in kind of like foreigner language do when somebody you don't know starts asking you questions. Yeah, we know him. Okay. Know where he is? Uh-huh. How's his family? Good. You know, and so they kind of answer like maybe, well, to be honest, like I do when I don't really know who I'm encountering. So he runs out and they give him this story about, well, it's in the midday, and we come here, and we water his flocks, but we can't water them yet. Jacob says, why aren't you just watering them, man? Go ahead and do the thing. We can't water them yet because all the flocks aren't here, and there's still one flock to come, and Rachel's bringing it, and she's bringing it, and there she comes now, and it's like the Marvin Gaye music takes off. I've been feeling tired, baby. You know what I'm talking about. And she keeps coming, and when you read it in the Hebrew, you kind of get this, he can't, it's like the kind of thing going, right? And he gets superhuman strength all of a sudden. There's this gigantic millstone on top of the well, and he goes over, and he's such in love, dude. You guys, you know this, right? You have to show off like for your girl, and he picks up this stone and throws it out of the way, and they all water the sheep. And so they go on their way, and he meets the love of his life. And so he is just spellbound. And so that's where we kind of some background of where we get into Jacob today, because it's the truth, right? Is that love makes you do some silly things in life. And Jacob, yeah, amen to that. Funny where you get amen sometimes. And we're going to see with Jacob, if you want to go ahead and put it up on the screen, we're going to see just a little bit about his story this morning from Genesis chapter 29 and verse 15. It begins pretty straightforward, and I think you all will, if you had a chance to read it this week, you'll be able to see it as well. So verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because he's gone and met his uncle, right? He says, because you're my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what shall be your wages. So in that effect, what his uncle says is hey man, you can't live in my house and be a freeloader. You got to have a job. And so what are we going to do? You come and see this, watch this. You'll see why he's asking. Now, Laban has two daughters. The name of the older daughter was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. And Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than I should give her to anybody else. Stay with me. And just leave it right there for a minute. Stay with me. So Jacob comes and he says, I like that one, Dad. And here's what I'll do. I'll work for you for 7 years to do. You heard what he says. And you go, wow. Man, he is love struck, right? How many of you go to your father-in-law in advance, men, and he says, are you going to be able to take care of my daughter? Well, I don't know, but I'll come work for you and live in your house and do anything you want for 7 years for your daughter. This is kind of where we get. But part of that, culturally speaking, you know this. Many of you have heard it before. They have this thing called the bride price, this dowry. And so in the ancient world, we would exchange goods and services when a marriage was going to be taking place. But Jacob's on the run, and Jacob doesn't have anything. And so he goes to Laban, and he offers the only thing he can give for the love of his life, his service. And he says, well, deal. I'd just soon give her to somebody in the family as I had give her to some guy I don't know. Real loving dad comment. This is kind of hard to get. But let's deal for a second here, because we get this idea that Jacob and Rachel, and they're all in love, and it should be this whole story. But the Hebrew writer gives us this commentary that Laban had two daughters, and one of them is named Leah. And this translation said her eyes were lovely. Many of them say her eyes were weak. Her eyes lacked sparkle. And I want to dwell on this one for a particular, because it's important here. I read a survey this week that said most girls, ladies, you might can answer that, most young ladies reach their peak confidence in life by around age 9 or 10. And then everything else in society chases that confidence away. And it wasn't just lame research either. I found that to be just, it took my breath away. And the reason I share that with you is because in the word that it speaks of Leah's eyes, in some translations in the Hebrew, you could say that she was timid. And I found myself wondering this week if maybe the case has been that Leah, the older sister, but given the description, the whole life she's lived in this world where she's always been compared to the younger one. And I know nobody in this room knows what that's like. I know nobody in here can really connect with always being compared to somebody else. How come you can't be as you're really good, but boy, your sister sure. Look at her. She's out running with the guys. She's herding the sheep with them. Look at her. If you can jump 2 feet, man, did you see her? She jumped 4. Or maybe it's more subtle ways, right? It's the subtle ways that, like the Hebrew writer gives us, is that all we get about Leah is that, well, she had lovely or weak or lusterless eyes. But we get a whole bunch about her sister, don't we? Wonder how many times around the table, wonder how many times in Laban's house, let's don't trick ourselves, he's got men who work for him, right? And honestly, men notice good-looking women. And so I wonder how many times that men Leah had been around and heard conversations and has heard them say, yep, look at her sister. And I wonder how many times she had sat there and wondered, but what about me? What about me? And the whole point of this, me sharing this with you, is in this story you really got to labor to work out what's in the story but is not written in the story. Because I think if you're honest, all of us can probably find parts and pieces of our lives in this story today. And maybe you can't find, like Leah, you can't find a time in your life where you've been compared against other people. if you're still breathing and it hasn't happened to you yet, I promise you it's going to happen at some point. And it does something on the inside, doesn't it? When you're always having to measure up against somebody else, when you think, well, these are the cards I've got to play, but what's wrong with them? And so it does something on the inside. And I don't know how that works out. But what I do know is that you also get the other side too, right? For Rachel was beautiful and shapely, and she could run better and jump higher and do all this great stuff. She could hang with the guys. I wonder if she was one of those girls like my girl is. If you get on the wrong side, she's liable to put you in a headlock. And Dad's in the back going, yo, man, do it. I mean, I wonder if to go with that beauty, she had that kind of tenacity that most people look at and go, yeah, like she's going places, right? Because Jacob sees her coming from a distance and he is overcome by her beauty, but somewhere along the way in the story, he works for 7 years in Laban's house. And I wonder how many times he had to find out just how spry, how spunky, how much fire she had inside, how beautiful she really was. And now, ladies, let's be honest. When they're living in the house here, and Jacob for 7 years, you got to dream with me a little bit here. For 7 years, can you imagine every day this guy who you've been betrothed to, so you're kind of legally married, but you're not really married. It's a weird sort of ancient custom. But every day you're in the same house with him, you're working in the field, you're tending all this stuff, and to hear Pepe Le Pew come up to you every day. Oh, mon ami, nobody, girl, knows how to herd these sheep like you. You know what? How do I love thee? Let me count thy ways. Every time she had to chase one of them down, hit one of the sheep with a stick, with the shepherd's hook, you know he's right, not very far behind. You know what, girl, you got great form. And nobody can do that to one of those little sheep like you. Nobody. And you got this whole 7 years of over and over and over and over and over, and him pouring his great love out for her and demonstrating that. You can kind of get excited about that, couldn't you, ladies? I mean, somebody every day, all day, no matter how much you work, no matter how far it was, you can just imagine with me, you start a day hearing about how magnificent and glorious you are and how God could not have done anything any better in the world than make the sun and you in the same day. And you ended the day with hearing about how the night could not be any more graceful because you are the most beautiful thing and the brightest light in the sky, even more than the moon. That kind of a thing. I could get used to that. And so that's the kind of environment that she comes into. And so when we get to the story, and you see, you can go on down to, skip to the next one for me. And so when we get into it, and so after he served her for 7 years that seemed like just a few days, the words of a lovesick man, right? Seemed like just a few days. Then Jacob came to Laban and said, give me my wife that we might live together, for the time is complete. And so Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. And they came together. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be with her maid. And in the morning, this is fantastic in the Hebrew, it was Leah. And let's stop right there. Now, men. Ladies, we're going to deal with a couple of things here too. Man, if you had worked for 7 years and for the one sister and you got the other sister, somebody's got some splaining to do, right? I mean, let's be honest. But secondly, ladies, I don't want you to miss something here either. in this is that if you've heard this for 7 years, how magnificent you are, how glorious you are, how wonderful it is for us to be a family together and be married, and then it becomes your time. It's your wedding day. 7 days this wedding thing lasts in the ancient world. In 7 days we celebrate this coming together of two people becoming one flesh and all of this. And then you think about it. Some of you got married now. If it's only in the ancient world half as complicated as it is in the modern world, you think of all the work you did to get married, all the work some of you are going to do to get married, all the things you looked forward to, all the excitement of picking out flowers and dresses and bridesmaids' gowns and venues and catering and flowers, all that stuff. This goes on for 7 days. And think that when it becomes your day, all of a sudden someone comes in and changes the game on you. Someone comes in when it's supposed to be the day that the one who has exalted you as the love of his life, someone in says, yeah, everybody else thinks it's you, but hang on just a second. We don't have a concept of what's going on right here. And then the other one, to hear her whole life about how it is that nobody really notices her so much, and Dad, I thought this was my sister's day. And all of a sudden to find yourself in a relationship that you really didn't bargain for. I have a real hard time with this particular story this week because it just doesn't make sense to us. It just doesn't make sense that this whole marriage thing doesn't work out the particular way and it gets tricked. So let me ask it to you this way. Does life ever happen to you and get in the way of your ability to love? Does life ever just happen and circumstances come along and it just train wreck shows up and your ability to love is all of a sudden squashed or minimized or run away? Because that's the thrust of this story. The thrust of this story for Jacob and for his now soon-to-be 2 wives is someone comes along, life happens in the midst of this grand love story, and it just wrecks the thing. And you have somebody who's supposed to look out for you, somebody who's supposed to care for you in a dad or whoever it might be, someone who's supposed to have your best interest in mind. And all of a sudden life happens and your ability to love and connect and feel loved is crushed. That's some of what's going on here. And look at poor Jacob. Poor Jacob he doesn't know which way's up. Everybody thinks that it's one thing, and now all of a sudden they see another thing. Isn't that what happens when life goes on? You get focused on one target, and then life happens and it shifts, and you see a different picture. And this is where we get, because Jacob has to go back to Laban and say, what are you doing to me? What have you done? Did I not serve you for Rachel? And why then have you deceived me? Laban said, it's not done in our country, giving the younger before the firstborn. Complete this week, and I will give you the other one in return for serving me for another 7 years. Jacob must be a pretty good hand. Because here we have his uncle, and to trick him into 14 years worth of service. And as Laura pointed out to us, the younger one stole the older one's blessing to start this story. And now all of a sudden, the younger one wanted to marry the younger one, but it's not our custom to do that. And so you see in this funny bit of irony that the story actually flips on Jacob. And he gets to see a little bit of what somebody else saw from his own behavior. When life happens, what do? And so Jacob did so, and he completed the weeks, and Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. So what do you do when life happens? What do you do when you got to go home? Now think with me again, like Jacob. He's married a woman that he did not work for. Anybody imagine what that conversation's like at night? Short answer is no, I can't. Isn't that true about you and I? When we have life mapped out and circumstances happen, isn't it true that we find ourselves trying to have conversation with person, places, or things that we never imagined we would have to have? How do you learn to love a woman that you never had desire for? How do you learn to love a man who clearly loves your sister more than you? What do you do when you're in the house and you've heard Pepe Le Pew dote on you every day, but you see him have to go home with someone else every night? What kind of conversation is that where he comes and he says, I know I'm married to your sister now, and we're legally married too, but you and honey, you're still the one. I promise, it's still you. And you think poor Jacob's at home trying to figure out, how did this happen to me? I was minding my own business. I was doing what I thought was the right thing to do. I was trying to be honorable for once in my life, and all of a sudden life has happened, and my ability to love has been radically altered. Because look at what the Hebrew said. It said, in the first 7 years it seemed but just a short bit of time. But he didn't say that in the second 7 years, did he? Ain't that the truth? Isn't it when life happens and you've got everything mapped out and your ability to love is suppressed or crushed or squashed or chased away? Isn't it true that when you have to get back to that point, it's a different ball game then? Somebody told you they would love you forever, and it turned out that they only meant for a little bit, and then for you to love again another time, boy, doesn't it take twice as much effort? When you give your heart to somebody, or when you trust them completely and they destroy that trust, isn't it true? Now maybe this is just personal confession. You love me, so it's okay. Maybe it's just me, but isn't it true that when they crush your trust, the first ones, fool me once? Isn't it true? When life happens, doesn't it just wreck our ability to love sometimes? And so what do you do with that? I mean, if you're a guy like Jacob and you're just trying to do what you can do, and life comes along and then you found yourself in this strange situation, or if you're somebody that really thinks that, well, everybody else has told me most of my life that I'm unlovable and I don't really fit in, nobody can really, you're that person. Or maybe you're the person that everybody has just celebrated your whole life and said you're just beautiful and marvelous and perfect and the greatest thing ever and the whole nine. But what happens when life happens? The good news is, for today, friends, is that Jesus is a better Jacob. Jesus is a better Jacob. Jacob does the best he can when life happens. But here's the deal. If you're the kind of person who has had one of those instances where most of your life, or if you're in the midst of life, you feel like that the world has run past and looked at you and said, how come you aren't more like them? Jesus looks at you and says, well, you're perfect. Jesus looks at you and does the whole thing that Pepe Le Pew does with Rachel. Jesus in his entire life is wooing you, is drawing you, is telling you that you are magnificent, that you are glorious, that you are perfect, and there's nothing, it doesn't matter what anybody else says about you, that you couldn't be any more perfect. If God had made another light in the sky, you would still outshine it. That's the kind of person Jesus is. He's a better Jacob. If you're the kind of person like Rachel, whose life has just been smooth sailing, and everything has been perfect for you, that's good. But then Jesus is still there for you too. Jesus is the kind of guy who looks you in the mirror every day, and when you say, you know what, self, I ain't all that bad. Jesus is a better Jacob because he looks you in the face and says, you know what? But I can love you into being better. Jesus is the kind of fellow who says, you know what? I'll love you until you're completely lovely, until there's nothing about you that anybody could ever not admire. He's a better Jacob. But what happens if you're like Laban? And most of life has been one of those times where it's just been about personal gain. And it hadn't been about anything else. What kind of conversations do you think Laban and Jacob had after this? He's working for him still another 7 years. And he's his father-in-law and his boss and about to be twice his father-in-law. I'm not sure how that happens. But I mean, what kind of conversations do you think that's like? What do you imagine it would be? And so what's it like whenever you have somebody who double crosses you and you still have to be in community with them? Jesus is a better Jacob, right? That's probably Jesus' story most of the time, isn't it? That Jesus loves implicitly and loves totally, and more times, if there's a bigger victim in the history of the world, I don't know who he is, because more times than not, he has been double-crossed. When he agreed for one love, it turns out, aha, it's something else. And I'll be quite honest with you. I've changed the rules of the game, too, when it's come time to really get engaged with Jesus at points in my life. I've been just like Laban. I've come to the point and said, yep, you're right. But then I tried to pull the old switcheroo on him. But you know what? Jesus is a better Jacob. Jesus has never held my self-interest, my selfishness against me. And I've given him every reason to. And Jesus is a better Jacob. But at the end of the story, well, this is how we all like the love story, right? He gets the girl times 2. You think of 14 years to work for the love of your life. You think how much time Jesus has worked for you, the love of his life. For the one who says in the book of John was there with God when God went and started the universe into creation and saw across the expanse of time and saw that he had to go and do a remarkable thing and be tricked, so to speak, all to get to you. Friends, Jesus is a better Jacob. He's a much better Jacob. And so if I could implore you to do one thing today, is no matter where you fit in the story, whether life has been one of those things to shape you into the timid person and you don't really feel like you've got what it takes, I remind you once again that the altar is a grand place to come and connect with Jesus and recognize that you're more than enough. There's nothing about you that is second rate. There is nothing about you that is not worth him working every day of every minute of every day. He says to you everything that you secretly kind of were jealous about when we talked about it. Jacob's saying it to Rachel. He says to you. He says to all of us. And even if you've changed the rules of the game on him before, take heart, friends, that's the grace we talk about. Because he just went up the way and agreed to work to another place where it's time for you to come together with him again. And maybe today is that place. This is one of those things that you got to work hard in this story. But the hard work comes to an end. It can come to fulfillment in a place at the altar. It can come to fulfillment when you have the opportunity to recognize that Jesus is a better Jacob and that he will not stop loving you. And he's never stopped loving you. And he's never stopped doting on you. And even when we change the rules of the game, he still says, you're magnificent, you're glorious, You're perfect. And I want to love you throughout time. Man. For a guy who's not much of a romantic, what a grand story to know that I'm a part of, that you're a part of. And what a grand opportunity as we sing this morning. What a grand opportunity you have to be included in one of the greatest love stories, the greatest love story ever. That sounds like preacher talk. Life happens and squashed my ability to love. I understand that. But my job's only to remind you that Jesus is not like any other man you've ever met in your life. He is the most enigmatic lover of people I've ever seen. I don't know how he does it. I just know he does it. And so no matter where your story might be, it might not be in some convoluted wedding thing here. It might not be in anywhere else. But what I do know is this, is that Jesus invites you into the greatest love affair of your life. Men, that includes you too. We sometimes struggle with the fact. We sometimes struggle with the fact that we're being invited into the greatest love affair of our lives with the Savior of the world. But you'll never be a better lover until the lover of your soul owns it. What happens when life happens? Kills your ability to love. I'll tell you what happens. Jesus. And he will restore your ability completely. And so this morning, if that's the case, I just invite you to the altar. I know it's kind of spooky to get out from the chair. What do people think? They don't know the circumstances. If they did, they would go, wow, I wish I had those guts. Don't worry about what other people think. Worry about Jesus, lover of my soul, who will never let us go. Worry what he thinks. As we sing this morning, if you would like someone to pray with you, I'll be happy to do that. Roy will be happy to do that. David will be happy to do that. Let your heart leave here full. And don't miss an opportunity to be loved into being completely lovely as we sing.